Andrew Russell, thank you for joining the New Zealand Aviation Podcast to talk about Continental Airlines Flight 11. First of all, what got you interested in this, and are you an aviation enthusiast by default, or is this, a particular incident that has your specific interest?
Oh, well, thanks for having me, first off. But yeah, to be fair, I was always an aviation enthusiast. I very fondly remember flying a lot as a child, and then obviously right through till present day, so 33 years basically of flying.
Mm-hmm.
And I have really just a sort of I don't know, I wouldn't quite call it an obsession, but I'm definitely an enthusiast.
Right.
It was just a natural thing for me to be inquiring about various incidents and, Googling wasn't around back then when I discovered the crash, but search engines and such. So it came about after 9/11, after the terror attacks, actually, on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the hijacked flights. And, of course, one of those was Flight 11. And There was an article in, I think it was the New York Post, about Flight 11 being an unlucky number. And it actually included Continental Airlines Flight 11. And I thought, well, that is not something I've ever heard of. And it said how it had been subject to a domestic terrorist attack, is basically what they called it at that time. And I never thought anything more about it. Really, until 2007. So that was 2001. I discovered it, read about it, brought up a accident report on it from the FAA archives site. And then 6 years later, I was at uni doing media studies, a Bachelor of Media Studies, and they said, well, you need to do a blog on something. Oh. And I had a separate aviation blog going, much like some of the ones that you see around New Zealand, like the Third Level Aviation and NZ Civil Blogspot and those sorts of sites. And I started a Continental Airlines Flight 11 blog, and I thought this will be a complete waste of time. No one's ever going to discover it. It'll just sit there idle. And then I started getting posts from people who were actually involved directly with it.
Wow. Yeah, we know about many of the crashes and incidents over the history of all of this. There are the high-profile ones, not so high-profile. I got to say, I hadn't come across this. I'm sure a lot of people would say that. Why do you think this particular, well, would you call it a crash, terror attack, why has this gone under the radar, I wonder, the way it has?
Well, no. Yeah, well, it's a question I've asked now, Paul, for probably the last 18 years, ever since I came across the accident report. And the accident report's quite fascinating because it actually was overseen by Mark Felt, who later went on to Watergate fame. Right. Obviously, the FBI became involved with the Civil Aeronautics Board, which, of course, was the precursor to the current NTSB. And at that point, for some reason, after 1962, it just seems to have been filed away in the FBI case closed files, and no one spoke about it. And I think a lot of the people involved with it who lost loved ones on the flight were told, you don't talk about this sort of thing. Your father passed away. That is all you need to know. Let's carry on as if nothing happened. And yet, of course, there are earlier crashes from the 40s, 50s and 60s that haven't been forgotten. But for whatever reason, I think because the FBI was so heavily involved, it's almost like no one can really get the files, almost. That's what I've heard from relatives of those who perished. It's been a locked down case almost.
Wow.
Since that time.
Okay, so we're May 1962, and the aircraft, it's a Continental Airlines 707, so pretty early 707, registration N70775, and
yes,
it was operating actually this aircraft has a bit of history. We can talk about that, and again, I would say in these cases, quite often you'll find that the aircraft sort of has form. It has a bit of history. I don't know if there's ever a connection, but quite often it seems to be that way. But this aircraft was just operating a normal domestic transcontinental flight, right? That nothing special at all about what was about to happen.
Nothing too unusual. It was doing Chicago to Los Angeles via Kansas City. And the flight was actually known as the Champagne flight. Literally, they fed champagne to everyone on board. It was a evening cocktail service out of Chicago. It was scheduled to leave about 8:15. It got away at 8:35 that evening, and by about 9:15 had more or less been blown apart over rural Iowa and Missouri. But nothing spectacular or interesting about the flight, certainly when it left the ground. There were 2 late-running passengers that they put the stairs back up for. Of course, this is pre-jet bridge era.
Yeah.
And the 2 people who were late were actually the people who, the gentleman certainly was the one who ended up blowing the aircraft up on its first leg. And the woman with him was actually his business partner, and his, how do we say this nicely in this era, was his love interest at the time.
Right. Okay. So now it is, you mentioned the word terrorist attack or terror, and it sort of filed under that, but it kind of isn't because, okay, who is this individual? And I'm wondering if the people with him knew what was about to happen, but who was this individual, and what was his plan?
Yeah, well, I mean, domestic terrorist is kind of a 2000s buzzword, but I think for him in the day, I mean, I think really what he was a very, he was Thomas Doty, and he had started a cosmetics business which had failed, and he owed quite a bit of money, and he was in with a business partner of his, a lady called Geneva Fraley. Now, both of these individuals were married to other people. It was widely speculated at the time that not only were they business partners, but they were also involved in a tryst. And he had obviously fallen on hard times, Mr. Doty, and he had robbed a woman with a gun in Kansas City, Missouri. And he was due to appear in court the week after the explosion, essentially the downing of the aircraft. He had purchased dynamite sticks, and receipts were found for those in his home when the FBI later searched it. And he had walked on to the 707 with $250,000 worth of life insurance and intended to blow it up, which he did. He lit the dynamite in the right rear lavatory. They knew it was him because of the dynamite receipts, and because when they found the body, of course, he was the only one, along with one of the stewardesses, who had dynamite residue on him. And, of course, he was one of the bodies that had been sucked out of the aircraft and the tail fell off. So he was pinpointed as being of that disposition. Of course, he had the court case coming up. He was on bail for that. And really, you know, with the debts that he had, it was concluded that he had done it. Whether his business partner, Mrs. Fraley, knew anything about it, we will never know. She didn't appear to be aware of the fact of what he was going to do that evening. And I think if she had, I'm sure she wouldn't have got on.
So he was wanting to, presumably his family, to claim the life insurance. Was that the plan?
That was, yes. And in fact, the family did try and claim the life insurance. And I think in the end, the only thing the widow got was a $3.50 refund on the postage that she had used to actually put the claim in. And the admin fee back then and all that was about $3.50. So she got a refund on that, but she never got the insurance because, of course, the FBI had said, well, we're 99.99% certain that your husband actually was the cause of the crash. And I interviewed a gentleman who had actually played poker with Doty in the 50s.
Wow.
And he often said that if he wasn't a millionaire by the time he was 35, he'd kill himself. Oh. And he was 34 when he went down with the aircraft, when he blew himself up.
Wow. You never know who's about to get on the plane, do you? Okay.
No.
Let's talk about the actual aircraft, 707 Continental Airlines, and I mentioned it had some history. So dial back about a year before this happened in 1962, and I think it was hijacked, wasn't it?
It was. It was a father and son who wanted to take it to Cuba, and ironically the plane was actually meant for Cubana, but Cubana Airlines never took up the aircraft and it went to Continental. But it was a 59 model, and the two gentlemen on board wanted to go to Cuba. I think they'd taken off from Los Angeles en route to Texas, to El Paso. They landed at El Paso. They wanted to go to Cuba. In El Paso, the 2 were taken out by essentially the G-men of the day, the FBI of the day, and the aircraft actually did receive some damage from stray bullets. The tyres were shot out, and there was some fuselage damage from bullets.
Right.
And it had from a stewardess former stewardess that I interviewed in 2013. She had been on the aircraft numerous times, and it had always been joked that it was the hangar queen. It had never performed as a 707 should perform.
Right.
It always, pilots didn't like that particular Regio. They always say there's sort of a lemon in the fleet. Well, that was the lemon.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, okay, he went to the rear lavatory and you said lit the dynamite. That's very sort of old school, isn't it? Sort of like lighting the fuse.
Very much. Very much so. He lit the fuse and the explosion occurred at around 9:15. There was a B-47 that was flying in the vicinity at the time, saw the explosion that had flown out of somewhere in Missouri and was heading north towards Des Moines in Iowa. The aircraft itself had been avoiding thunderstorms and tornado reports that evening, actually, around the Iowa-Missouri border, and the weather had been horrendous that evening. And the captain had climbed all the way to 39,000 to actually avoid it. I mean, for a 1-hour flight, that was quite a high altitude to get to. And just as they were starting their descent for Kansas City, it's just on the Iowa-Missouri border, which is about a 2-hour drive south of Des Moines and about 45 minutes drive west of Kirksville, Missouri, which is the nearest sort of airport these days. But the aircraft, the dynamite went off. The aircraft depressurized. There was a hole in the side initially, it's thought. The crew had donned oxygen masks and had got out the emergency checklist. The gear was down and locked. And unfortunately, no Mayday call was ever received. The tail broke off within the first few seconds of the decompression. And the aircraft pitched nose down, and the engines actually disappeared as well. They were found a mile further on from the actual wreckage. The engines had been flung off with the impact of the descent. They'd actually fallen off. And the aircraft had more or less sort of cartwheeled itself into the ground. It just spun out of control at that point and hit the ground about 6 miles northwest of Unionville, Missouri, which is a town around then was around 2,000 people. It's now about 1,200 people. Very rural, remote, small town. And people in the town that night thought it was thunder that had returned from the storms earlier, but it was actually the aircraft exploding the dynamite exploding, and then it was the wreckage actually slamming into an alfalfa field.
Crikey. And not much chance of surviving that. 45, I think, on board. I don't know if that was the passenger number or the total number, but
45 total.
There was an individual, I think I read, who actually survived the crash but died at the scene or soon afterwards.
Yes, Takahiko Nakano. He was a Japanese national who was actually living in Chicago. We don't know why he was on the plane, although I have spoken to his family since. I actually had a Japanese friend do the translating for me, and they finally came forward last year. In fact, I got the email from them literally as I hopped off a plane in Los Angeles last year, which I find a little bit spooky. But very odd timing. But he survived for about 90 minutes.
Wow.
He was taken to a hospital in Iowa, but he died literally upon arrival there. And they told him what had happened, and he went into shock and died.
Oh, crikey!
But apparently there were no specific injuries that they could find on him. He'd actually he was still strapped into his seat, and he was on top of basically of other passengers, unfortunately, and bits of wreckage and suitcases. He had fallen through the cabin floor and kind of into the baggage compartment. The wreckage was fairly intact, and it's often speculated that the aircraft entered such a strange pitch that its forward speed actually diminished towards the ground, and it was in such a dead stall, it sort of fell straight down at some point after it had done its spinning. But again, that's speculation because, of course, in those days, the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder, all that, they didn't have a cockpit voice recorder. And the flight data recorder was fairly, speculative. It was very imprecise information.
So it wouldn't have been a very difficult job for the investigators to work out what happened. And as you say, they were able to go all the way to the person who did it, got all the evidence. I don't think you said it was covered up, but it was sort of buried. And again, you come to that question, why would it have been buried? Were they worried at that time that there could be copycats or... I
think they were. I think it's often been... I actually spoke to the captain's daughter, Captain Fred Gray, who was the CEO's best friend, actually, literally. Who at the time was Bob Six, who was one of the old mavericks of aviation, and he'd taken over Continental as the president and the CEO since it was Varney Speedlines in the 30s. So he went right back.
Yeah.
And Captain Fred Gray's daughter often speculated that there was fear of copycat, and there was fear, I think, in the 60s that someone would sort of see him as not a martyr, but, at the time, you've got to remember there were a lot of desperate people. You had the McCarthy trials from less than a decade earlier, and you had a very jittery America with in the early 60s, and I just think a lot of things like that were often papered over simply because they were scared of a copycat, I think, at that time, especially with no security, and you wandered onto the aircraft, you boarded via the stairs, and off you went.
Gosh, the level of trust that used to exist is just mind-blowing compared to today, right? Oh, yes, and I actually stayed with the son of the man who put the stairs back up for the bomber. Wow.
And, because back then customer service was everything. You didn't worry about OTPs, about on-time performance. You worried about the customer. And he actually put the stairs back up to that aircraft and saw them both board, and Fraley and Doty. And he had remembered the stewardess had actually brought him a cup of coffee from the Ford galley. And she said, well, good night. We'll see you when we're next in Chicago. Here's a cup of coffee. And, of course, she shut the door. He pulled the stairs away, and the aircraft took off for the last time.
Wow.
And one of the stewardesses I interviewed, who was the one that told me the aircraft was unreliable, so to speak, she had actually seen the crew that night. She'd got into Chicago, and she was actually meant to be on the aircraft. She'd swapped with a friend.
Wow.
And the friend ended up on the aircraft of course, lost her life. But she actually said, good night, Freddie. Of course, that was the captain's name, Fred Gray. And she said, good night, Freddie. We'll see you in LA. And back then, they used to send the Boeing 720, which was the faster version on the non-stops to Los Angeles, because, of course, it was all a speed game back then. Who could get there quicker?
Right.
Amongst the different airlines. And they sent the older, slower 707 via Kansas City. So there'd actually been a last-minute equipment change that night.
Right, okay.
That plane was meant to go straight back to LA, but it actually ended up on the Kansas City run.
Yes, there's always a backstory operating. Yeah, those 720s, they were there for speed, weren't they? The 600 mile an hour plus.
They were.
The inboard wing was different, wasn't it? It was a different shape.
It was, and they preferred working on it, actually. They said it just felt a little bit better. And it was a slightly newer airframe than the 707-100s, which a lot of the crew, they did, like I say, they did not like that particular rego. It just had a funny feeling, and I don't know whether they sort of speculated on that later or whether it really was true, but it was often said the 100 series was a bit of a dog out of the 707 family. Yeah,
it was underpowered and first generation. For someone like yourself and, what you're saying, you've obviously gone into it quite deeply. You've talked to the actual people, which is always an incredible thing to do because, that's so close to the story. What's that been like? And it sounds to me like from that blog that you set up initially, it's gone so deep, way more than you ever thought. Am I right?
Oh, it's insane. And, I'm sitting here 12 years on and think from when the blog was started, and I'm thinking, wow, how the heck did that happen? And I've got emails that came in and blog posts that were quite shocking. And people saying, good morning, sir, I am the captain's daughter. And, you get emails like that and they pour out what had happened. And there's a lot of people got a phone call 2:00 in the morning from Continental to say, well, the aircraft is overdue. It never arrived in Kansas City. And there's a lot of personal information people have shared with me about their loss and about how they dealt with it, and a lot of criticism on Continental, actually. There was a phone call at 2:00 in the morning, and then that was about it. Because back then there was no victim support, there was no specialised team, and they were basically told, shut up and carry on, which I think sadly was a bit of the general attitude back in the 60s, especially in the States, which, back then was fairly conservative. Well, it still is a fairly conservative nation on the whole. But, these people were mainly Midwestern-based, or some in LA. They moved on with life. But some of the emails I got, especially from former crew members who remembered some of the flight attendants, that was very, very heart-wrenching to read the stories about, they flattered together and some of the cocktail parties that the captain would have. And it sounded very much like the Dean Martin jet set, and it was.
Yeah, it was then. Yeah, it was. Yeah,
it was. And, of course, for the families, though, who lost people, that was particularly horrendous. And there's a lot of details I received that, for me, of course, I was in my 20s at the time, it was quite a bit to swallow. And, some very, very nice emails from virtually complete strangers, some telephone calls as well, people who had played golf with the captain or knew where he'd lived in Los Angeles, or people who'd known his wife, and people who'd flown on the aircraft. And a lot of Continental staff came forward, check-in agents, ticketing agents, people who actually remember checking people in that night for that flight in Chicago. And they came out of the woodwork. But the families, of course, have formed some very lasting bonds because of the blog and because of the memorial efforts themselves. That was just gigantic when that came out.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I think at Unionville is where the memorial is. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there was an initial one, and there's been a more recently, I think in 2010. Again, I might be wrong with the day or the year.
2010 was the initial unveiling of the memorial stone in the middle of Unionville in the town square, actually. And I wasn't present for that, but 2012 I flew into Des Moines, actually, and ended up getting picked up and driving basically through cornfields for about 2.5 hours to this tiny little town, which no one had heard of. But that was 2012, was the 50th anniversary, and of course I was flown over especially for it by Dwayne Crawford. Now, Dwayne Crawford was in his 70s at the time, and he was a former Marine, and he had taken a big interest in the history of the area. And he had actually seen my blog post and got in contact with me in 2008. And from there, it went on, and he said, look, I'm going to get this darn thing built. And he did. He went out and contacted all the families. And, of course, because he was in his 70s, he'd never used Blogger. But I was kind of the go-between between family members, and I passed their details on to him, and then he'd call them up on the old-fashioned telephone. And, of course, from there, that's where the memorial stone idea came from, was to get a memorial going. And then, of course, they had the big unveiling in 2010, and then 2 years later I was over there, and that was very strange, actually, meeting these people. Very, very strange. And they'd never heard my accent was completely foreign. It was a shock.
It's a kind of crazy situation, because here you've got someone from the other side of the world with no connection that you would ever
none at all
realize, or could make, and yet this happens. It's kind of good that you can.
Well, it was bizarre. I think would be the best. I mean, it's good, but it's still sort of. I still think, and I think about it, and I think, how on earth did that did that connection happen? Yeah. It is a very, very strange thing.
I was just thinking, as you're talking about the maybe the lack of empathy, institutional empathy in the day for people caught up in something like this, that it wasn't too long after the war, was it? 1962, you're within less than 2 decades after the war. A lot of people in commercial aviation at that time had their start in the war. And a lot of the pilots, a lot of the people who operated airlines, were in the military, were in the air forces, and they were used to seeing their colleagues going off and not coming back, and they got hardened to it, didn't they? So I wonder if that played a part in that lack of empathy that came across in that way.
Well, quite possibly. I mean, I've spoken to some pilots they're now deceased who were flying at the time. They were in their late 90s when I talked to them, and they knew the crew very well. And I think their attitude was sort of, Freddie Gray bought his farm tonight, sort of thing, And it was a very militarial attitude towards it. They were cut up about it, but it wasn't something you spoke about after the funeral.
Well, you didn't need counselling. You just you staunchly, stoically got on with things.
Yeah, but I always think it's a bit sad that they, certainly for the 3 cockpit crew, that they had the gear down and had the checklists out.
Yeah.
Once you've lost that tail, you're over, really.
So they must have, if they were in the descent at the time, were they when this happened?
Yeah, they were coming through 36,000 out of 39.
Okay, so that's very early to put gear out. So that must have been a very, urgent response to the situation.
Well, that's what's speculated because, I mean, again, there's no cockpit voice recorder, and there was no Mayday call, sadly, but from what I've read in the accident report, it's quite possible that they blacked out simply from the G-forces from a very early stage because that thing pitched so violently. I think they did the first couple of steps and that was it. It was sort of interrupted really when the tail fell off.
Yeah.
But
yes, it overstressed.
Even the flaps were down. Yeah, it had shorn off really. And the tail was found in Centerville, Iowa, and the fuselage, of course, was in Unionville, Missouri, right over the border. The tail had come off very early on. Right,
and the engines had obviously advanced somehow, maybe fuel in the system, still some power, and, a crazy sort of gyrations, I think, have been described, obviously made it further than the wreckage. So,
yeah, they were found about 3/4 of a mile to a mile forward of the wreckage. Onwards from the wreckage. And they had dug themselves into the ground so deeply that they needed to dig it in to actually get them out. They'd actually continued rotating right until impact.
Wow. Okay.
Which just sort of bamboozles me, but that's what was ruled at the time by the Civil Aeronautics Board.
As long as they've got fuel, they'll keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And the guy who found the wreckage in the wee small hours of the 23rd of May, I've interviewed him extensively. He's in his 70s now, so he's not too old. He was only a teenager at the time, but he came across the wreckage and he said it was the spookiest thing he had ever seen, this giant broken aircraft in the middle of a field in the moonlight.
Yeah.
The weather had cleared up by then, and they had a party line that was literally ringing red hot from the sheriff, and of course they could smell the gas in the air, and people's flight tickets were blowing around, and napkins, magazines. Someone actually found a champagne bottle that had not smashed. Apparently, I'd love to know how that happened, but they found a champagne bottle and a galley cut, and people realised, of course, what had happened up there. And then they came across the wreckage, and it was just absolute pandemonium descended, really, by daybreak.
Fascinating story, Andrew. Thanks for alerting us to it, and thanks for coming on our podcast and talking about it. And, for people who want to go find out more, the information is available. Now, there's a book that you've published, and it's called Missouri Crash, The Bombing of a Continental Airlines 707. How can people get to that?
They can get that on Amazon.com. There's a Kindle version, which is only about $2 US, and then there is the paperback version, which is about $9.50 US, and that's a paperback book with my mugshot on the back. Yeah.
And the aircraft on the front, the graphic I'm looking at, is that the actual aircraft?
Well, we're 99% certain it is. I've had people tooth comb it, and they think it is. I don't know how they can think that, but that's what I've been told, that it is actually in 70775.
Right.
And that photo, we actually do not know where it came from. It literally turned up one day on the blog from an unknown poster, and we've never been able to trace its sources. So
funny that.
Yeah, very odd.
Another one of those things. Okay, well, I suggest if our listeners are interested, to go and pursue those links and find out and have a good read. And thank you again, Andrew, for coming on and talking about it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.